Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This morning, we're just waiting for a few more commissioners to join, and then we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. Commissioners, I'm turning on the ability to start your video and audio.
Good morning, everybody. I think we'll just waiting for Ethan here. There he is.
I'm here, Jim.
Right. Well, I think we can get started. My name is Sean Varner, and I'm the Vice Chairman of the Little Hoover Commission, and I am standing instead of our Chairman, Pedro Nava, who cannot make it today. Thank you all for joining us today on this really important topic. I would like to introduce the other commissioners who are here today. Commissioner Bill Emerson, Commissioner Dion Erner, Assemblyman Quirk, Assemblymember Quirk, Commissioner David Beyer, Commissioner Kathy Schwamberger, Commissioner Cynthia Buiza, and I believe, is that all we have today? Oh, yeah, there's Senator Min. Welcome, Senator Min, for your first hearing today with us.
Thanks so much, Vice Chair Varner. I'm glad to be here. I appreciate the mission of this. We need good government, and appreciate this and look forward to seeing you all at future hearings.
Well, we know that you're going to have valuable input, and we really appreciate your service.
This is Bill Quirk. Unfortunately, this is probably my last meeting, at least as a panelist and a member of the commission, because they rotate us through this, and I've been told that I'm going to be rotated out. Again, not my decision. It's just they want us to have a broad experience of as many different commissions as we can. So I've been on others, and I'll be going to another one sometime soon.
Well, Assemblymember Quirk, we really value your input, and you've been a great resource on this board, and your input's been incredible. So thank you so much for your service as well.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I'd also like to introduce our staff that's with us today. Our Executive Director, Ethan Rarick, the Deputy Executive Director, Tamar Foster, our Project Manager, Crystal Beckham, who's leading this effort here on affordable housing, and Tristan Stein. And then we have analysts Sherry McAllister, Ashley Hurley, and Rachel Mattioli. So welcome, everybody. Little housekeeping before we get started. The commissioner's audio will be turned on throughout the duration of this hearing. Commissioners, you can mute yourself if you wish. Remember to unmute yourself if you want to make a comment or ask a question during the hearing. You can also use the raised hand function. I'll be checking out the screen to see who would like to comment during this process. The video and audio of all hearing witnesses will be turned on when it's their turn to speak. Just as something that Chairman Nava likes to state that during your testimony today, if any witnesses are testimony and we interrupt you, it's because the value of the statements and things that you're making may cause some of the commissioners to want to follow up immediately on the topic. So that just means that everyone's very engaged. Members of the public will be muted during the hearing, and we'll have a public comment session at the end of the hearing. Those who wish to make a comment will be unmuted at the time that their public comment is ready during the hearing. If you'd like to make a public comment, please use the raise hand feature in Zoom by clicking on the hand icon to join our public comment queue. If you've joined us by phone, you can either dial *9 to raise the hand on Zoom or send an email to littlehoover@lhc.ca.gov. Indicating that you'd like to address the commission. You must provide the phone number for which you have joined the meeting so our staff knows who to unmute. Staff will be monitoring raised hands and emails, requesting comment throughout the duration of our hearing. And as is usual during our commission hearings, public comment, of course, will be limited to 3 minutes. So please try and make your comments form within that time frame. We are recording today's hearing, and after the hearing, staff will place a permanent link to the recording on our website and upload it to our YouTube channel and Facebook channel, because we are social media savvy. And now to the substance of today's hearing. This is the third commission hearing we've held on creating affordable housing and evaluating the opportunities on affordable housing. Today, we continue our focus on how do we strengthen the relationship between the state and local governments, to increase the supply of affordable housing, and hopefully to how we can implement it efficiently and effectively. Our study examines how the Department of Housing and Community Development can work within this relationship to facilitate the creation of affordable housing in communities across the state. Throughout our hearing series, we've heard perspectives from stakeholders outside of government, as well as representatives from local government. Today, we will hear from current and former state housing officials about the work they are doing to promote affordable housing in California. The hearing, again, as I mentioned, was organized by project manager Crystal Beckham, and I'd like to have Crystal get us started.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Our first witness today is Secretary Lourdes Castro Ramírez. She heads the state's Business, Consumer Services, and Housing Agency, and she also serves on the California Strategic Growth Council, the California Housing Finance Agency Board, and she chairs the Homeless Coordinating and Financing Council. Welcome, Secretary Castro Ramírez. Thank you for joining us today. And when you're ready, please unmute yourself and begin your presentation.
Welcome, Secretary.
Thank you so much, Chair and members of the Commission. Thank you, Crystal, for that introduction. And thank you all for inviting me to speak today about the state's efforts to address one of the key challenges of our time, housing insecurity and increasing access to quality, affordable housing across the state. As Crystal mentioned, I'm Lourdes Castro Ramírez, and I serve as the Secretary of California's Business, Consumer Services, and Housing Agency. Our agency is responsible for coordinating housing across the full continuum, ranging from our efforts to prevent and end homelessness to expanding affordable housing and homeownership. We ensure that Californians have access to some of the strongest consumer protections in the nation and promote fair housing. Throughout my career, I have had the privilege of seeing the transformative power that access to affordable housing has had on communities. I've seen these efforts and have worked to implement impactful strategies at all levels of government. At the Cabrillo Economic Development Corporation, the largest developer of affordable homes in Ventura County, I saw how housing was used as a catalyst for financial health. At the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, families had access to affordable housing. When they had access to affordable housing, their health outcomes were improved overall. Now at the state level, in my current role, I see how housing can plant a seed of hope. I believe that every California family deserves a chance to live their dreams. Having access to dignified, stable housing is a critical part of their ability to do so and to achieve their potential. Governor Newsom appointed me to serve as secretary in March of 2020. And since then, I've been working closely with his administration and with our agency to address the immediacy of this pandemic and its effect on housing stability. What we have done as we respond to this pandemic, we have also stayed very focused on our long-term priorities to preserve housing affordability. We've also focused on increasing the supply of housing and ensuring that more Californians have a place to call home. And we're playing a critical role in ensuring proper coordination across the state, strengthening relationships with local partners, and working together on our shared goals. California has often been criticized for lacking a comprehensive, holistic approach to addressing housing affordability. When investments were made, they were often seen as being piecemealed or not significant enough to address the scale of the problem. This is changing. Thanks to Governor Newsom and the state legislature, the allocations in the latest budget shows the largest housing and homelessness investments in the state's history. California will be deploying $10 billion to accelerate housing production and $12 billion to tackle homelessness, with funding for home key units, shovel-ready affordable housing, mortgage and rental assistance, as well as direct flexible resources to local governments to use in their efforts to prevent and end homelessness. These massive investments are not possible without the continued partnership of the legislature and our federal partners, with significant funding coming from the American Rescue Plan. The California legislature has made it clear that they're invested in tackling these issues, as indicated by our shared budget, as well as the recent legislation that they have passed, which makes it clear that it's important to build more housing in our state. Just last week, the governor signed several notable housing bills: Senate Bill 8, SB 9, and SB 10. These bills are critical in furthering our efforts to expand housing production across the state, with key provisions helping to streamline development, to provide regulatory certainty, and expand housing density, all with the intention to focus on creating more inclusive and vibrant neighborhoods across the state. We, of course, cannot do this without a coordinated effort. I'm a firm believer in that. And we're grateful for our federal and local partners. Together, we're making sure that these historic investments and these historic resources are helping as many Californians as possible. So as we deploy these resources, we're doing so with an eye to equity and inclusion. Our charge is clear. We need to build housing across each segment of the market. And we must recognize and address that housing is not being produced for very low and extremely low income households who have been squeezed out of the housing opportunities and continue to bear the burden of increased housing costs. While we have made significant budgetary investments, successful execution requires planning. This effort is primarily met through the housing element process, the foundation of state planning law. As you know, local governments are required to periodically update their housing elements in their general plans, which HCD, the Housing and Community Development Department, plays a critical role in evaluating. For years, housing element laws were designed to allow local governments to simply check the box and send it to the state without expecting the state to approve. And for years, local governments were able to skirt the intended accountability and avoid planning for actual housing needs in their communities. Today, that has changed. Over the last several years, the legislature and this administration have been focused on increased accountability, providing HCD with the tools to hold local governments accountable to providing realistic housing elements. And while we have increased planning accountability, we have also increased our investments to help local governments do this upfront planning work. The state has delivered nearly $400 million to local and regional governments for planning activities, and next year, there will be an additional $600 million available. There's already evidence that this work is paying off. In early 2019, there were 47 jurisdictions that had a non-compliant housing element. Today, only 10 of those jurisdictions remain out of compliance for the 5th cycle. And during the last planning cycle, California planned for close to 1.2 million housing units. For this upcoming cycle, the state will plan for more than 2.5 million units of housing. That's about 116% increase. And while we're continuing to make progress on achieving our planning goals, we must also focus our efforts on both short and long-term priorities. Our short-term priorities are focused on keeping vulnerable Californians housed. Countless households across the state were impacted by COVID-19, resulting in hardships that made it difficult for residents to pay their rent or meet their mortgage obligation. In response, the governor's comeback plan provided billions of dollars for both rental and mortgage assistance. The California COVID-19 Rent Relief Program has dispersed $584 million to stabilize almost 50,000 households. And we expect to continue this momentum in the months to come as the state transitions to new eviction protections that run through the end of March of 2022. In addition to rental assistance, the state will also be deploying mortgage assistance to be administered by the California Housing Finance Agency. These federal resources are expected to be dispersed next month to help homeowners, actually next quarter, to help homeowners get current on their mortgage payments and help households transition from existing forbearance protections. While we work to stabilize households in the short term, we must also continue to build an equitable recovery by making long-term investments to our state's affordable housing stock. To help address the state's affordable housing shortfall, last week, HCD launched the California Housing Accelerator, a $1.75 billion plan to provide funding to shovel-ready multifamily housing projects that are ready for development but need this extra layer of funding to ensure that they become a reality. In all, this funding will produce between 6,300 to 7,200 units of affordable low-income housing statewide. Of this amount, almost 1,200 units will be targeted to individuals and families experiencing homelessness. HomeKey played a pivotal role in the state's response to COVID-19 to house those experiencing homelessness. The HomeKey program generated 6,000 units that came in the form of acquiring hotels, motels, underutilized or distressed spaces, and converting them into deeply affordable housing. 2 weeks ago, we launched the second round of HomeKey with $2.75 billion in the budget over 2 years. As we continue to move with speed and urgency on HomeKey, we will continue to work closely with jurisdictions to provide targeted technical assistance. Finally, the state is thinking out of the box to create more housing units through the use of accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, which is another part of our long-term strategy. In just 5 years, the state has experienced nearly a 10-fold increase in permitted ADUs. In 2020, jurisdictions permitted approximately 12,600 ADUs, accounting for 12% of the total housing units permitted in the state last year. To capitalize on this surge of ADU interest and production, next week, CalHFA will announce the standing up of a new ADU program to catalyze the production using $100 million in funding to provide grants to homeowners to assist them with pre-development activities. This is expected to bring about 5,000 units of housing online quickly and efficiently, with the added benefit of helping low and moderate income households and communities to build wealth and equity. It's hard to overstate the important role that we play in facilitating cooperation and promoting collaboration across cities, counties, and regions. With recent policy changes and significant funding for housing, California is paving the way to a different future. While we have a lot of work in front of us, our commitment is clear. How we invest these funds will tilt the scales, creating more housing and reshaping the state's housing landscape. Our agency departments and staff have been hard at work implementing existing and new catalytic programs, making generational housing investments to come out of this pandemic stronger. As we build on this meaningful progress, we will leverage and strategically target resources coming from the federal government. Just this week, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development announced its House America initiative to address homelessness by leveraging the American Rescue Plan resources. We're hoping for additional federal resources, of course, as we can't do this alone. It takes all of us working together. So as I close by saying that I am very optimistic, I am grateful that you are all elevating the importance of housing, housing access, housing affordability, as I believe it's fundamental to opportunity and prosperity. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Secretary. I have Commissioner David Byer, who has a question, so I'll turn it over to Commissioner Byer.
Sure. Thank you, Madam Secretary. I have to say that was an incredibly impressive presentation, great detail, and I view your role as perhaps the second most important in state government, below the governor. Housing is clearly related to health. The social determinants of health are affected by housing, but also income inequality, which has as its root housing inequities, and many of the other issues you raised, homelessness and economic mobility. In thinking about this hearing, I decided to do a little bit of research, so bear with me. My daughter lives in Oakland on the border of Piedmont. Piedmont has 11,000 residents, and their target for 2031 is 587 low-income units. They failed in the last housing element. They had 60 was their target, and they got to 37. It seemed unrealistic, so I did some work, and it seems like the root cause of much of this goes back a long time. In the 1920s, Sidney Deering, an African-American, bought a home there and then had to move because bombs were planted in an attempt to blow up his house. And ever since then, there's been redlining, racial discrimination, denial of mortgages, and things of that nature, not just in Piedmont, but other places. And the legacy of those activities is still with us today. And it seems like one of the legacies is excessive regulation. The average home cost, the median home cost now in California is $850,000. And as experts have told us, much of that cost, that excess cost compared to other states, comes from regulation. So my question is, what is your department doing in cooperation with others, whether it's CEQA or other cost adding factors, to lower the cost for developing low-income housing, as opposed to providing financing for an excessively regulated sector?
Yes, thank you, David, so much, our Commissioner, very much for your question, and thank you for the deep dive right into understanding how this manifests itself in local community. I will share a couple of things, and then I'll go right into your question about what is the state doing, right, to minimize barriers and to reduce the cost of producing housing. A couple of weeks ago, I had an opportunity to visit with leaders in the city of Merced around the same sort of conversation we're having today, which is around understanding the challenges that they're having with producing more housing that is affordable to working families, to essential workers, to farm workers, to families on fixed income. And as I was looking at their numbers, their production numbers over the last few years, a very similar trend to what you've just described. They have produced less than 9% units that are for low to very low income households. So that is our focus. As a state, we are producing housing, but we're producing housing for moderate and over moderate income households. So what we need to do is we need to be able to strategically target our resources to ensure that we're producing the units that the market is not producing. And that means that we have to be more integrated and coordinated in how we invest our dollars So a couple of things that we're doing at the state level, HCD, the Housing and Community Development Department, CalHFA, who's the California Housing Finance Agency, and through our agency working with the governor's office, we're also very much working in partnership with the state controller's office and the state treasurer's office to ensure that there is alignment in focus and intentionality when we're deploying our resources, aligning our funding cycle so that developers have more predictability. We're also within HCD consolidating multiple housing funding programs into a super NOFA, super notice of funding availability. So again, to minimize the hoops that developers have to jump through. As I mentioned, in terms of the role of the federal government, as federal resources are coming in for housing, we are ensuring that those resources are going to target those priorities that we have. And that includes leveraging everything, including vouchers. We're working closely with local housing authorities to ensure that one, that they're aware of the funding that's available to build more housing, but that they're also committing vouchers, rental subsidy to ensure the long-term viability of those units. So we're very mindful, Commissioner, that cost can often be a barrier, and that we need to do more to produce housing that is more deeply affordable.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate what you've said. Again, just to go back to the regulatory implications, it's great that there's more money, but if the money's being spent on, I'm going to paraphrase Barack Obama, stupid stuff. In other words, if the bureaucracy, the legislature keep adding costs, and the cost for developing a new unit of housing in California is far in excess of any other state, there's got to be a examination of the regulatory burdens. Again, I use CEQA as an example. It could be not using gas for cooking purposes in new units. It could be solar mandates, many of which individually make sense, but cumulatively are driving up the costs and making it harder and harder for developers to create the units that we want. And so it seems like in addition to the supply-demand equation, there's a cost component which is not front and center in most of the conversations.
Yeah, I would agree that much more needs to be done to continue to reduce or minimize the regulatory barriers. I will share that with Home Key 1.0. So the Home Key initiative was really in response to protecting individuals experiencing homelessness and to provide permanent housing. And in the period of 6 months, leveraging $846 million, we were able to produce 6,000 units, largely because of the approach and the model that was set up, which included basically exempting these projects from CEQA. So they were, there was an accelerated path, and these were, of course, units that were converted, hotels, motels that were converted. In this next round of Home Key with 2.75 billion, the same rules will apply. And so we expect for these units to move quickly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I wanted to real quickly just acknowledge Commissioner Erner and Commissioner Senator Nielsen have joined us, and I've got a couple of hands raised, so I'll start with, and I take them in the order that they raised. So I've got Senator Nielsen and then Senator Min. So Senator Nielsen.
Yeah, let me pipe in and thank you. My apologies for the delay. We had a big ceremony welcoming the emergency responders. They're doing a 130-mile bike ride acknowledging emergency responders. So that's occupied my time. I wanted to put some dollars on this. Several years ago, an advocate for the homeless was speaking to a group that I was a part of, and she said, you know, if we ease the regulatory burden, we could save $7,000 per unit. Now, that's the first dollars I've seen that have been put on the cost imposed by government, and I mean the executive branch and its entities therein, and the legislative branch, that have exacerbated the cost. And it's critically important that that be attended to and dealt with by the legislature, these regulatory excesses. And another thing, and this is societal, but as a society, we've got a little bit of work to do on the hypocrisy. And I'll make an example. One county that I represented for many years, an agricultural-based county, but a very wealthy county. And we needed farm worker housing. And don't put it in this town. Don't put it in that town. Oh, anywhere else, but not there. These people who are enjoying this nice lifestyle in this wonderful area are very happy with what they've got. But and I said, well, what are we gonna do with the workers? Well, they'll have to live somewhere else. That's just hypocritical. And then several years ago, another very wealthy county that I have not represented, but they come into the Legislative Budget Committee asking for an 8-year extension on meeting their low-income housing requirements. It's probably the wealthiest county in California. And I just do not abide with that hypocrisy. And we need to put right back in their faces that, no, you will accept your fair share. The rural counties that I represent, we do our fair share. But wealthy counties, because people don't want to have the not wealthy living there, that's a real impediment to our progress. And I'm sorry I vent that with such passion, but it's a huge aggravation and it's a clear part of the problem that we are dealing with. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Senator Min, and then Commissioner Schwamberger.
Thank you very much. And I guess I'm pleased to say this is my very first question on this commission. So I just want to thank you for your testimony, Secretary. My question was this, you know, I come from a little bit of a federal affordable housing finance background, and you know, this is not a California specific problem. Obviously, California has much higher real estate prices than most, maybe all other states. But the problem of low end housing is one that vexes us, and it's often thought of as a problem of incentives. We don't have enough money to make this profitable. And, you know, when I think about the problem writ large, you know, at the very low end, developing quote unquote affordable housing costs a lot of money. And that money has to come from somewhere. And we can talk about leveraging, we can talk about reducing costs through maybe regulatory exemptions, things like that. But at the end of the day, it's not profitable for developers to build this. So we have to build in subsidies to make this happen. And then I guess my other sort of observation is in California specifically, what I've noticed is that we don't have enough workforce housing, which is everything trends towards single family, it trends towards high quality luxury units. And obviously that's where the profit margins are largest. But you know, I guess my two-part question is to what degree is the affordable housing problem here in California? And by affordable, let's talk about both low, very low, moderate, and you know, maybe even average. You know, in a lot of regions, including in Orange County, which I represent, if you make area median income 100% of it, you're still having trouble affording something at, you know, the standard percentages of your income on a monthly basis. So to what degree is this problem unique to California? And then secondarily, what recommendations would you have on, you know, catalyzing the development of workforce housing for people who make, say, between 75% and 125% of AMI, because that seems like a place that we in the legislature don't seem to focus on as much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Senator Min and Commissioner. And it's great to hear that you're coming at this also from a federal perspective, because the federal investment and commitment to housing is critically important. What I will say is that we know that the housing, that the market without intervention by federal or state or even local government will not produce the housing that families that are working and making, or that are low wage workers, that are, as you described, workforce housing, right? They're working, but they are unable to afford the rent or afford to even access to become a homeowner. And so we're very focused on being strategic about how we deploy these resources to produce more housing that is deeply affordable. And when I say that, it's households primarily that make below 80% of area median income. The biggest gap for us, though, is for families under 50% of area median income. What we're seeing with the rental assistance program, just as an additional sort of indicator, 86% of all households that are applying for rental assistance that are back and behind with rent are households that are making below 50% of AMI. So there's a lot of vulnerability and instability in within those households. So we are, trying to do our best to ensure that we're leveraging the federal dollars that are coming in, the state dollars, and also creating the conditions at the local level to be able to create that type of housing. And kudos and thanks to the legislature, because over the last few years, there have been a number of regulatory changes that have enabled us to do that. With regard to, what is the state doing for with maybe some call the missing middle, maybe individuals that are just above the 80%. We are focused on efforts to ensure that there's affordable housing that maybe is not subsidized, that allows for that income bracket to access housing, because we know that they're also being challenged because there's not enough supply. So some of the strategies, I think, include the accessory dwelling unit approach. We also have, through CalHFA, a home ownership and home buyer assistance program. And frankly, I think we will need to continue to look at how to access additional housing resources, but also looking at the other part of the equation, right? Incomes and wages across the state.
Thank you, Senator Min, for your question. And I think, one area we've talked about in the past, I believe, is that the issue about workforce housing is that several people who work in San Francisco, LA, Orange County cannot afford to live there. So they're traveling 2 to 3 hours or 4 to 5 hours a day just to get to work, which has other implications with regard to environmental issues and things like that. And I know it's a difficult topic, but it kind of goes back to what even Senator Nielsen was indicating, is that we need to find a solution where people can afford to work where they live or live where they work. So I know Commissioner Schwarzenberger had a comment as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for the information you shared. And I think what I want to do is connect a lot of what you shared with the issue Commissioner Nielsen raised around continuing obstacles in some local communities. It sounds to me, from what we've heard today and what we've read before, a lot of bills have been passed. I think a big housing package even back in 2019, some bills this year, a lot of money being allocated to address the problem. In your view, is all of that enough, and now it's just a matter of time before these things are addressed? Or even with all of those bills and resources, are there still things that need to be done so that these obstacles don't continue to exist, as Senator Nielsen pointed out? You talked about accountability for local governments, reaching their allocation. That's in place. But I guess what I'm asking is it going to be fixed now, right? With all of the bills and the money, or is there more that needs to be done so that we manage, I guess, the resistance in those areas where we do have the resistance?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. That's an excellent question. And as a a person who's also very much an operations person, overseeing operations and executing, I do think that it is fair to say that many laws have been passed. The regulatory environment is changing. There's more focus on accountability. In fact, HCD is establishing an accountability unit to ensure that local communities that are not meeting their housing element goals and are not being as aggressive as they should are held accountable. We're also, of course, providing incentives, and cities that are demonstrating aggressive plans and efforts, would be eligible to receive a pro-housing designation that enables them to have access to additional resources. So there are a number of laws, more resources, historic amount of resources, but I do think that it is important as an operations person to give us a little bit of time to put these things in place, and then to assess if this approach and strategy is working, needs to be tweaked, needs to be adjusted. Because I think, like everything, we need to cement and kind of almost ensure, right, that we have the right structure and the right capacity and the right level of coordination, and then to step back and figure out what more do we need to do. As a community developer, also as a kind of comprehensive, when I think about housing, housing from my perspective, very fundamental, right, to everything that we do. However, where housing is located, how it's connected to community, how it's connected to transportation, how is it addressing our climate goals, how is it addressing better access to education or schools. I think that's the next sort of phase of, as we implement and deploy and create more housing. I do think that there will be sort of the opportunity, right, in terms of, can we do more? Yes, we can do more. What more should we be doing? I think we need a little bit of time to get these things off the ground. But I think we also, as we begin to assess, I think we also need to pay attention to how the housing is integrated to the fabric of that neighborhood and how we're creating resilient and healthy neighborhoods.
Thank you. I have Commissioner Erner and then Commissioner Emerson.
I want to thank you, Madam Secretary, for testifying today. I guess I have some concerns in that, given the results that we've seen so far over the years, right, of local governments who say that they're interested in building housing, but actually when you see the results of what goes on, very often it's not in my backyard, as Senator Nielsen spoke to. I live in a very progressive community. I live in Berkeley. Berkeley is no different than any other community in regards to NIMBYism, right? And we're trying to do some stuff around transit villages and things like that. And the amount of time and that goes into the effort of even just getting to the point of making a decision can be years, that kind of thing. And so I was interested in the planning money, because I guess I remember Jerry Brown 1, meaning when the governor ran the first time, he didn't like the P word, as we called it, the planning word, because you can plan things to death and never have any outcomes. And so I'm interested in, what's the planning money for? Who's it going to? What's the purpose of it? Lots of communities get to the planning stage, but they never get beyond the planning stage because of the fact that there are so many obstacles, whether they're regulatory obstacles or financial obstacles or neighborhood obstacles, right? As Senator Nielsen spoke to. And so what's the planning money for? Who's it going to?
Yes, the planning dollars are for local governments to work on their housing elements and to ensure that as they're moving forward with meeting their housing element or housing goals, right? That there's a plan for getting there. And I would also, in the planning sort of bucket, I would include our infill infrastructure program. Oftentimes, as you know, there are, when we look at land, and there's a possibility of being able to to build housing, but the cost, to ready that land, to build the infrastructure, makes it very difficult, right, for affordable housing developers to make it happen. So there's $500 million in the budget that allows for us to be able to couple infill infrastructure with planning dollars to be able to, support pre-development activities that will unlock the potential for more affordable housing.
All right, but then let's get to the accountability thing. So what happens, right? I mean, we have a history now, right? You spoke about, somebody spoke about Piedmont, lots of Bay Area cities. There are 101 Bay Area cities that are part of, ABAG and part of MTC. They don't have a real good record, I don't think, amongst them, most of them, right, about building housing that we need. What does accountability mean? Are we going to fine them? Are you going to take money away from them? Is someone going to get fired? What happens here? I mean, it's a real problem. How does one state agency, hold accountable another agency, right? We're talking about all public dollars, whether they're at the local level or at the state level or federal. How does that work?
Yes, so we're standing up a new accountability unit within HCD, and this accountability unit will be responsible for closely monitoring the housing elements. And if there is no effort or progress being made, those housing elements in those cities would basically be deemed out of compliance. And there are several, steps that HCD can take, including working with the state attorney general office. This is, it's critically important that they be in compliance because there are certain state dollars, right, that and federal dollars that are going into this effort. In the past, we've also pursued legal action against jurisdictions that are failing to comply with their housing element. So this accountability unit is really prepared to ensure that jurisdictions that are not meeting their obligation in terms of producing the housing that their population needs, that they fulfill that obligation. And if they're not fulfilling that obligation, HCD will be prepared to take appropriate action. I will also say that we're also providing a lot of technical assistance to jurisdictions. We have an entire team within HCD that is working closely with jurisdictions to help them plan, to help them access resources, to also provide additional capacity building. I mentioned home key earlier in my remarks. Another sort of feature of the success, or the reason for the success with home key, was how our HCD team worked with local communities. We established an HCD ambassador unit that basically provided technical assistance to cities, particularly cities that don't have the same level of capacity when it comes to developing housing.
Infrastructure.
Exactly. So we're doing both, Commissioner. We're very mindful that it's important to acknowledge and recognize jurisdictions that are, very much leading, and we're very mindful that we need to do more as a state to provide technical assistance and to be partners. We're also not afraid to hold jurisdictions accountable when they're not meeting their end of the stick.
Gotcha, thanks. So I have just one more question. A person who's going to testify after you, but we were fortunate enough to be able to see their written testimony first, right? Talks about the four different agencies at the state level that have something to do with housing. And you mentioned at least one other, right? Which was the financing, CHAFA, the financing authority. I can't remember the other two. Something's a debt limit or something. I can't remember the other two, right? But in my experience, right, as a former legislator and as somebody who's been around the Capitol for many, many years, is the state is not a very good model normally for coordination. And when we know the legislature had a tendency always to demand integrated services and everything at the local level, but never demanding that at the state level. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how the four different departments, or whatever their units are called, how is that coordination going? Because somebody has to lead, right? In order for
Right.
something to work, somebody has to lead. Somebody has to step up and say, we'll lead, and we'll coordinate and to be able to figure out so that the local agencies aren't talking to 4 different entities, getting 4 different answers, right? How did that kind of thing. So I'm interested in how that works.
Yes, I completely agree. I think coordination of the housing finance system is critically important. And we have been very focused on internally within agency. So the agency that I oversee includes the Housing Community Development Department, the California Housing Finance Agency. It also includes the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, which pursues civil rights cases, fair housing, discrimination cases. And so having that department also within agency and helping us think through our fair housing laws is important. Another department within agency is the Department of Financial Protections and Innovation. This department regulates all financial service providers in the state, including mortgage servicers and lenders. And so they have been very involved also with forbearance protection. So as an agency, I see our role to coordinate, right, and to ensure that the efforts that are ongoing are connected and that we're driving the governor's agenda. And the governor's agenda is very much about increasing housing production, minimizing barriers, creating more housing that is deeply affordable, addressing homelessness comprehensively. So that has been our focus within agency. The California Debt Limit Allocation Committee and the Tax Credit Allocation Committee, which are basically responsible for bond allocation and tax credits, falls under the California Treasurer Ma. We have a great relationship with Treasurer Ma, and there's a lot of coordination that occurs. The structure also of the TCAC and CIDLAC board over the last few years has changed. And so within the CIDLAC, the California Debt Limit Allocation Committee, the HCD director, Director Velasquez, and the executive director of College FA, Tina Johnson Hall, they're both members of CIDLAC, along with the state controller and the state treasurer and the governor or a governor's representative. And that, I think, governance structure helps us be better aligned. In a very similar structure within TCAC with 2 additional members. So I think that, just going back to your question, my sort of belief is that it is important to properly understand the problem and the root causes and to develop the approach and the framework for addressing. And very much our approach is preservation of housing affordability, production of affordable housing, protection of families that are facing housing instability, and making sure that we understand who we're serving, that we're people-centered. The third element is more resources. The scale of this problem is so big that we need more resources. But in order for us to be effective, there has to be a coordinated approach. There has to be a coordinated plan, and we have to hold each other accountable. And then the last thing that I'll say, Commissioner, just because you got me going here, but the last thing that I will say is that outside of that kind of housing finance system focus, we're also working across state government to look at the intersection of housing, climate, transportation, economic development. Some of that happens within the Strategic Growth Council. Some of that happens within the Climate Cabinet, because we know that when we look at communities together and are more thoughtful about how we invest our dollars, we're able to stretch the dollars, right? But we're also able to do things together, because at the end of the day, my parents, when they see state government, they don't see right? They see what are you all doing together to make the quality of our life better?
So lastly, I said lastly before, I know, but all this, you sparked some other thoughts. And it's a reality, whether it's the pandemic or whether it's the wildfires, the lack of workers, right, of construction workers at this point, right? I mean, you hear everybody anybody who's interested in building an ADU, for example, right, or doing something to their home or whatever it is, can't find workers to do it. And so I guess the other problem here is that even though there might be a flow of dollars, right, and as you mentioned, this is not going to happen overnight, right? What do we do about creating a workforce, right? I mean, the interesting thing about building trades jobs is they're really good paying jobs, right? That they create families that have an economic, viability to actually buy a house. And so, are you sitting down with the labor agency at the same time to try to figure out, what do we do about this? Because where are we going to get the workers to build these future homes?
Yeah, yes, excellent point, Commissioner. And yes, working closely with the Labor Secretary will be very important. We have a new Labor Secretary that was appointed by the governor who starts, I think, at the early part of October. And I already have a meeting set up with her.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Great.
Okay.
Okay, Commissioner Emerson.
Thank you. I appreciate your testimony, Madam Secretary. Commissioner Erner touched on most of the points I was going to make, so I'll be very brief. The 8-year reporting period that regional areas report to the state, is that time period too long? And how can we better evaluate their housing elements progress during that time period? And
yes, good question, Commissioner. I don't know that it's too long. And maybe it goes sort of back to the question that one of your colleagues mentioned. We need to give people time, right, to implement, to plan, to establish their goals, to demonstrate and implement. And the reality of, housing production is that it takes several years to see units up. But I will definitely, jot that down as we should be thinking about the cycle, it's an 8-year cycle, too long. With regard to how we track and monitor, there are annual reviews. They're required to provide annual progress reports, and the HCD team is required to review and validate. And this is how the accountability unit will be also able to take any action.
right, thank you.
Thank you.
Secretary, I just had a quick question for you on the California Housing Accelerator. I understand these are funds that are generated from some of the COVID relief funds, and I think it's a one-time allocation. Is there any merit to the thought process that a fund like this, an accelerator fund like this, could be looked at as some, I realize we need to bring down the cost of housing, but that this could somehow, I know we've tried to replace redevelopment funds in various jurisdictions in all the counties throughout the state. Is there any thought about looking at this type of accelerator in the context of how redevelopment funds were deployed for affordable housing throughout the state?
Chair, that's a great suggestion. I will say that we have not had discussions about that, but you're absolutely right that this is a one-time allocation in this year's budget, and we are leveraging American Rescue Plan dollars and are moving very quickly to deploy these resources. So let me sort of jot that down as maybe a follow-up conversation with our team. Thank you.
Great. Do we have any other anybody else have any questions for Secretary? I'm not seeing any. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to discuss this with us. Your testimony was invaluable, and really appreciate your service to our state. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the meeting. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay, Crystal. Back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Our next witness is Claudia Cappio. Ms. Cappio is a former local planning official, and she also formerly served as the director for both the California Housing Finance Agency and the Department of Housing and Community Development. Welcome, Ms. Cappio, and thank you for joining us today. When you're ready, please unmute yourself and begin your presentation.
Good morning, and thank you for the reminder for unmuting. I'm pleased to be here today, and I hope my remarks prove useful. With my background in both the local and state levels of government, I have been both deep in promulgating state regulations and policies and needing to figure them out about how to make them work at the ground level. I'm here. As I noted in my outline, we all need to acknowledge that any changes in how affordable housing is administered at the state and local level involves huge changes and huge multiple year efforts to pull off. This applies to any one of the suggestions noted here today. I've been asked to comment on potential consolidation of state agencies, how a dedicated or permanent source may work, and how the general plan housing element has worked. During my tenure in Sacramento, we really explored potential consolidation of state housing agencies, and it was all put into something called a project implementation document, or PID. We focused particularly on the consolidation of the California Housing Finance Agency and the Housing and Community Development Department. We went through the exercise seriously, and in the end, there was no consensus or political focus to move ahead. But we were able to have a few collective wins, including a comprehensive multiple agency cost study on affordable housing and a new a sustainable communities and affordable housing grant program that used cap and trade dollars. So in looking through my notes of that work, it's clear to me that a comprehensive reorganization would be Herculean or Sisyphean, depending on where you are. And I think the housing finance function and the management of physical assets are what I would like to comment on today. By physical assets, I mean the tens of thousands of units right now that are under the jurisdiction or management authority of CalHFA, HCD, and TCAC. The first big challenge with affordable housing finance is that the three major tools that are used, debt, equity, and subsidy, are spread over at least 5 entities in state government. CalHFA, the California Debt Limit Allocation Committee, and CalVets provide financing through the issuance of bonds or debt. TCAC provides tax credits or equity, and HCD provides subsidy. The second big challenge, as noted by the Secretary, is that the state treasurer is an independently elected office, and currently she administers both CIDLAC and TCAC programs. So there's a big jurisdictional issue there that would need to be figured out. But if we step back and look at how those finance functions could produce a more unified and effective state affordable housing strategy, because debt, equity, and subsidy could all work better together, there's some potential outcomes that I've noted. One, we could develop a comprehensive short, long, and medium-term investment strategy. Secondly, a uniform underwriting procedure could be established so that no matter how many forms of funding you're asking for, there would only be one underwriting procedure. The use of a master or universal development application for projects, again, no matter how many forms of funding you're asking for, the standardization of regulatory and other forms of agreement, and a data management system where departments and agencies would agree to a set of data that is essential to track. Right now, there's not such a system. Also, I think we tried to do this, but again, it's really hard to create a unified housing finance portal for the state so that any interested party, be it citizens, developers, banks, or potential homeowners, could go to one place to find out what programs and funding are available. When you look nationally There are a number of state financing agencies where all these tools are in one place. Washington, Minnesota, and New York are regarded as good examples. Asset management. As I noted, CalHFA, HCD, and TCAC have tens of thousands of units under their management. They must perform periodic checks on physical condition, on tenancy compliance, and on financial audits to meet federal and state requirements. Presently, these monitoring activities are done by program and agency, not by function. Consolidation here makes sense in terms of the efficiencies gained. My guess is that a whole lot more units could be monitored per year in addition to early problem identification and resolution. Dedicated source. For years, for decades, a dedicated or permanent source of housing has been advocated for in this state, and many people have worked very hard to make it happen. In 2017, SB 2 was passed, led by State Pro Tem Tony Atkins, which placed a recordation fee on certain property transactions. Over $600 million has been collected to date for a variety of important programs and initiatives. Although $600 million is major money, the fact remains that only a small portion of meeting, it would only be a small portion of meeting the need. To put it in perspective, if the average subsidy is per unit is $100,000, which is quite conservative, but just for argument's sake, 600 million could produce 6,000 new units. But the projected need in California over the next 8 years of affordable housing is 1.2 million units. So if you do the math and divide by 8, that's 150,000 units needed per year. Other approaches to a stable source or dedicated source of funding could be looked at, such as a fee on mortgage initiation or a state version of the Community Reinvestment Act for electronic banks and mortgage issuers. The housing element process. The general plan housing element has been a factor for nearly 40 years. Throughout my career as a local planner, I constantly had to update, make sure it was in compliance, respond to new regulations and requirements. There have been a number of achievements during that period that are important, including eliminating barriers to housing production, increasing the land available for housing development, and providing a more equitable means to share affordable housing city by city through the regional housing needs allocation process. But when you take account of the millions of dollars and thousands of hours spent at the individual community level, all this effort did not produce directly any affordable housing. It was not responsible for producing anything. The key question is whether other approaches that are less contentious and complicated would have achieved results. One answer, as described by the Secretary, is providing further technical assistance. I know that's been instituted and is currently being ramped up so that cities are able to look at their housing element and their housing needs through more experienced and competent kinds of people that only do this. There are so many jurisdictions in California that do not have that in-house expertise, and this will really help. The other big initiative would be to figure out funding strategy that local governments can use to produce more housing, because that's the essential element. You can produce housing, you can't produce it without money. So just a few suggestions. I want to end with this thought. If we could take a few steps back and apply John Rawls's theory of justice to this problem, that all stakeholders would get in a room, leave their current turf funding programs and other interests at the door, and come together in what he called a veil of ignorance, where we could design a new system for delivering affordable housing in California, but each person or entity would not have any idea during that design process of where they would eventually end up, how many resources they would have, or what funding they would have. Instead, the focus would clearly only be on the better provision of housing in California for people who really need it. I'm not certain of what the structure would look like, but I am sure that if it were done, that structure would look far different than it does today to deliver services. So I appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts, and I would be glad to address any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Commissioner Byer. You're muted, Commissioner Byer.
Oh, sorry. Thank you for the testimony, especially the reference to John Rawls in the original position. It's a pretty esoteric reference, but I love it. I want to drill down on the one suggestion that you made about California being thinking through similar structure to Washington State and New York and I think Minnesota. One of the things that the Little Hoover Commission did in a report, I can't remember whether it was 2015 or 2016, was focusing on citizen-centric government. That is, making interactions with government not dependent on knowing the name of the acronym or what it stands for, or the various coordinating committees. And what your testimony suggests is that there's a better way to do things. And I recognize that reorganizations in the California sense are fraught, difficult, probably not worth it. But is it possible for the state of California to do what you talked about that these other states have done by only passing pretty straightforward legislation? Who would be for it and who would be against it?
The hard questions. The tax credits and the California Debt Limit Allocation Committee are now administered by the treasurer. And those are really important functions. And I just for simplicity's sake, she might have trouble putting them in a super finance agency. The trouble with looking at HCD and CalHFA's consolidation, which was that CalHFA put up the argument that they were an independent agency and that any consolidation would interfere with their bond rating because they have to have an independent status. Although we really worked hard at ideas and structures that would likely work, there wasn't the political will to carry it off. There were other priorities. There was a drought, there was climate change, but you have to try. A super finance agency for this state where all the financial tools are coordinated, I think would go a long way in developing a comprehensive investment strategy. Right now, we're sort of in a boom or bust cycle, right? We have bond money, billions, blank, go distribute it. We have this funding that Governor Newsom has been able to gather and really advocate for, and bam, it's out. But it's not stabilized over a period of years. And you could look at longer term, like a fund for land acquisition, like a fund for making sure that people have backup strategies for mortgage guarantees or loan guarantees. You could really come up with a more comprehensive way to look at supporting affordable housing in the state.
Thank you.
Okay, next is Commissioner Erner.
So I want to thank you for really a testimony full of information. So I want to kind of follow up on Commissioner Byer's question and your comments regarding it, it is difficult to reorganize state government. Many of us have lived through a variety of reorganizations, and in fact, I lived through some where we started in one direction and then a few years went right back to where we were before that, right? We could go back and forth, and particularly in the healthcare world, about how it should be organized. But you also mentioned, though, that how do citizens get awareness of what's out there for them? Right? And I don't just mean homeowners or people who want to be homeowners, but developers and all of that. And if I understood you correctly, you kind of said that there is no, that other states have developed the technology so that a citizen could go to a website, and on that website, I think this, I'm translating it into language that I understand, to be honest, that they could go to a website where all of those different funding structures they could see them all, so that they understand what their choices are with descriptions. That cannot be difficult to design at all, right? You could probably give that to a 20-year-old intern at UC Berkeley, and they could design it for you for free. And so part of this is whether or not the state could get itself coordinated, but could we at least have things available to the public so that they know what's out there, even though there are all these different revenue streams and all of that. And as you said, you tried to put some of them together. That's difficult for whatever the reasons are. But at least if we could have a way that the public would know that there are these different funding streams, here's what they are for, here's how long they are available, and here's how much is there. You're right, that would be nice if there was a common application or whatever the terminology is, so that it didn't matter which funding stream you were applying for, that all of the information that was needed would be in one form that you could then apply for all five, six, whatever the number of revenue streams are, that kind of thing. So I'm interested in what's so difficult about that.
Well, we tried to do that. We thought we did get together as the funding agencies and really tried to work better together, like master calendars for the year for hearings and coordination. And I think that's continued, as I think the secretary indicated. What we had trouble with was there's a Department of Technology, I believe, at the state level that's in all the high-tech stuff. And that's been centralized, or at least it was. Right. And they were like, where's the money? Right. And we didn't have any budget allocation for this. And it is expensive. So we tried to look at the rudimentary aspects of designing a website and what would be on it and how it would work, but we couldn't go to the next level because the next level required the Department of Technology to help us and provide technical assistance, and they wanted big bucks, and we had to delay it, and then I changed jobs.
All right, because I mean, the reason I happen to have some knowledge about that. The reason they charged you a whole lot was because they were developing their department, and were wooing, other departments to come to them, but they didn't have a whole lot of clients from the departments. Right. So it was very expensive. Whether or not it's that expensive to use them today, I have no idea.
I don't know either, but it's a great idea, and it is technically possible.
Absolutely.
A state of 40 million, where someone could go and say what's available and then plug in a couple of menus and see, oh, I think I could be eligible for this funding, would be huge. And I don't know what the current state of the art is. I mean, there might be something like that.
Well, we see it in the private sector, we see it in the private nonprofit sector all the time, right? Where you can go to a single site and find out all kinds of things about what's available to you, right? And so it's kind of interesting that for some reason that hasn't been done, because it would disconnect the public, seems to me, so that the public would know what government's offering.
Right.
Okay, thanks.
All right, I'm not seeing any other questions for you, Director, but thank you so much for your testimony and for your, I think it's a unique perspective that we're seeing about being more efficient in the way that we review the funding from the state, and I think that's extremely valuable. So thank you so much for your testimony.
You're welcome, and much success to you. I hope that you continue to batter on.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, I will turn it back over to Crystal.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Our final witness today is Ben Metcalf. Mr. Metcalf serves as the Managing Director for the Terner Center for Housing Innovation at UC Berkeley, and he also served as the Director for the Department of Housing and Community Development formerly. Welcome, Mr. Metcalf. Thank you for joining us today. When you're ready, please unmute yourself and begin your presentation.
Mr. Metcalf, we're having trouble hearing you. It looks like you're unmuted, but we cannot hear your voice.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, that works.
Okay, thank you. Apologies. I'm very pleased to be here today. As Crystal said, my name is Ben Metcalf. I am the Managing Director for the Terner Center for Housing Innovation, a research and policy center based out of the University of California, Berkeley. I also speak today from the perspective of having run the state of California's Department of Housing and Community Development. In my testimony, I want to focus on a few specific recommendations I think the state might take that will be helpful for increasing the supply of housing, particularly in the context of the HCD's longstanding housing planning oversight role with city and county governments. I'm going to focus on 3 specific recommendations where I think the state might better use data and data analysis to inform its enforcement and administration of existing state housing laws. Fundamental to all of what I'm going to talk about is the notion that we need to invest much more substantially into better data systems and build out the technical capacity of state and local governments to effectively use that data. This does require, as we've been talking about, continued investments into information technology, into technical assistance, into data planning. There is an effort underway out of the HCD to build out a statewide data strategy plan, which I think is a very promising step in the right direction. And over the last couple of years, we have seen significant investments from the state into technical assistance to local governments and regional governments, the LEAP and REAP programs being the 2 most notable of those that I think are very promising green shoots, if you will. But let me talk about the 3 specific things I think that are worth working on. First, the state needs to rely on realistic and or objective estimates of how much housing is likely to be developed when the state approves local housing plans that are submitted to it. Under current law and practice, HCD assigns every metropolitan region in California an estimate of the number of new housing units that will be needed over the next 8 years to meet its needs and accommodate population growth. This is the RHNA process. Each of those regions then passes along with allocations to individual cities and counties. And every 8 years, those cities and counties must demonstrate that they have a planning regime adequate to sustain that capacity of new sites, their regional targets. That is reflected in their updated housing element. However, what constitutes adequate capacity in the context of any given residential site has not been consistently interpreted at the local level or at the state level. The city of Los Angeles recently collaborated with us at the Terner Center to attempt to come up with a solution to this challenge and to develop an empirical model to project what kind of housing could be built on the city's existing residential land. The model looked at historic rates of redevelopment for housing to develop a forecast of what redevelopment might look like on similar sites going forward. This allows for a discount. A site that maybe is zoned for 8 units will not necessarily produce 8 units, but it may produce a partial amount of that over time. It may have a 50% likelihood of moving forward, for example, or a 20% likelihood of being built at 8 units. Existing law and guidance reinforces a concept that cities should base their projections not just on what a site could theoretically hold, but what is likely to get built. But in practice, the ways in which that has been happening to date have relied on anecdotal assumptions of likelihood, which are often much more generous than what we see in the data and what we see in our research in terms of the likelihood of redevelopment on a given site. There is definitely an opportunity to embrace a more rigorous approach in modeling these forecasts for housing as we get to the next housing element cycle, and even potentially in the current cycle. There are opportunities for HCD in its role of approving local jurisdictions' housing elements to conditionally approve those until such an analysis might be completed. Second of all, the state has an opportunity to encourage those cities and counties to better model the cumulative impact of proposed local housing policies. These might be impact fees, parking requirements, inclusionary housing, and other local policies before they're enacted. Estimating the likely impact of specific housing policy changes has also historically been very much anecdotal. To the extent there are analyses that have been done of specific housing policies, those models typically look at the consequence of those policies in isolation from the other policies that are in place in those cities. In reality, the full spectrum of land use and housing policies have an interactive effect that collectively need to be assessed in order to understand their impact on whether a housing unit might or might not get built. We've done some work on this as well at the Terner Center in terms of building a tool that allows a city to onboard parcel level land use information with a financial pro forma to model those aggregated impacts of overlapping housing policies. The ability to toggle up or down different scenarios to see the likely effects of whether housing will get built under different market conditions and with different policies allows for a much more nuanced understanding of what changes to housing policy at the city level may do for actually helping them achieve the supply goals, that the new housing goals that they may have. And it may also be very helpful for understanding the underlying binding constraints that are in practice the things that are limiting more housing from getting built on any given site. It may be an onerous parking requirement. It may be the economics. This provides an opportunity for the state to use data and data tools like this and offer a more nuanced approach for local policymakers to give them the tools to at least benchmark or at least have a point of reference as they move forward new housing policy reforms to see if the model would likely affirm that their policy goals are being achieved. Tools like these also equip advocates outside of government to be in a position to better hold policymakers accountable, particularly in the face of very complicated housing policy regimes. The reality is today, some policy interventions that policymakers move forward at the local level may yield counterintuitive effects. They may sound good in theory, but result in a trivial or even negative change to the likelihood of development on a given parcel. No model perfectly predicts future activity for sure, but policymakers can make better decisions when they make those decisions based on the best evidence and analysis available at hand. Third, there is a huge opportunity for the state today to use data-informed strategies like the ones I've been discussing to more directly drive where the limited staff and capacity resources of the housing department's new housing accountability unit spend their time. New legislation over the summer, the budget bill authorized a new housing accountability unit to be stood up within the Department of Housing and Community Development. This unit is now charged with formalizing what has been a longstanding but often ad hoc effort to monitor local governmental compliance with the lengthy list of state housing laws. The state can and does occasionally bring legal action against cities and counties, most notably against Huntington Beach in January of 2019. But most of HCD's enforcement work today has been achieved through more of the soft touch issuance of hundreds of informal advisory letters to cities, cautioning them against actions that might violate state housing law. To date, however, much of that has been informed and motivated by a reliance on third parties to voluntarily inform HCD of possible infractions. It has not been driven by a proactive evaluation to understand where housing is being significantly and artificially suppressed through policies that have the consequence of driving down new housing supply. Taking a data-informed approach could actually allow HCD to target its enforcement capacity and technical assistance towards jurisdictions whose annual rates of permitting new housing are lagging behind both their RHNA targets and that which a statistical model might suggest their permitting ought to be for any given year, based on a real-time sample of comparable jurisdictions' rates of permitting. As this new unit gets staffed up, this is an important way to begin to think about driving, again, these individuals' time, talent, and resources towards those places in California where we are seeing the least amount of performance relative to what we would expect they should be achieving, and not using enforcement in an anecdotal or reactive manner that merely responds to the loudest complaint at any given time. Lastly, in addition, HCD's current information technology platform for tracking local governmental housing element compliance, which is called the Housing Element Tracking System, or HETS, is brutally antiquated and sorely in need of updating. It doesn't currently offer a robust system for tracking and flagging the failures of cities and counties to achieve the programmatic commitments incorporated in their housing elements, which mandate action during the planning cycle, but may not happen absent a good tracking system. This is an obvious fix and opportunity for the state to invest to make sure that we are using data platforms to dummy-proof our compliance regimes. And that concludes my remarks. Thank you, Commission members, for your attention to this important topic, and I'm very happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Metcalf. Commissioner Byer.
Yes, thank you for your testimony. If I'm not mistaken, there's a study done by your center at Berkeley about the potential effect of SB 9. That is, at best, it would influence 5% of the total number of single-family units in the state. So if you combine SB 8, SB 9, and SB 10, all of which are, I stipulate, positive advances in housing policy, what's the net effect between where we are today and where we need to get as a state? It seems as though we've bitten off somewhere less than 10% of the policy instruments necessary to get to our goal. Is that roughly correct?
It really depends on the time horizon that you're looking at. So our one of the conclusions that came from our study is, in fact, that the state's accessory dwelling unit laws had already put in play a potential 1.8 million new homes. With SB 9, the additional single-family homes that are now newly feasible only goes up by an extra 700,000, which is the 5% you get to. I think what's missing from that top-line conclusion is the fact that many of those ADUs would never have gotten developed. ADUs are very difficult to finance and very slow, but I think SB 9 does offer a significant uptake. So units that would have been built as ADUs can now be more easily financed through SB 9 as duplexes or condominium or lot splits. All that's to say, you're absolutely right. Even taking all of that, we can really only look to our single family neighborhoods to satisfy a share of the total housing growth that we need to happen. And so, yes, there is continued work that has to be done to figure out how we can facilitate infill development in our urban cores and along our commercial corridors, and to look potentially at places where we can do new construction of housing as well. So SB 8, 9, 10 is not the full solution to our housing woes. It is a significant step forward, and it's importantly a step forward to a part of the state that has not shouldered any of the new growth really whatsoever to date.
Thank you.
Mr. Metcalf, your model seems to be fairly comprehensive in how it deals with where affordable housing is today and maybe how to streamline looking at it. I was wondering, from when you look at, does this model that you put together, you commented on what it would look like if redevelopment were implemented. Is there a model that could look at the costs associated with, if redevelopment were implemented, what those costs would be with the access to redevelopment dollars as opposed to what the cost is today without it?
That's a great question. The modeling that we've done has not been specifically looking at affordable housing. We have done separate work that's really looked at the cost to build affordable housing. So less about where you located and more about the challenges of getting it built. And to echo some of what you heard from Claudia Cappio, we have definitely heard that the cost of affordable housing has continued. We've definitely found that the cost of affordable housing has continued to rise, not just because underlying inputs like labor and materials have gone up and land, all those have gone up, but also because of the increased complexity of putting these transactions together. And we've found significant costs associated with the multitude of different financing sources that developers have to bring to bear. Redevelopment is at the end of the day, is a local funding source, and developers can access that local funding source to help fill a gap, or they can go to the state, or they can go to the federal government. I think the challenge that we've tried to focus on in our work is that it matters less exactly where the money comes from, and more that the money be coming out in a way that's coordinated with the other investment and financing and funding tools in the toolkit. So what is very harmful to the affordable housing industry is when you have local funds that have different criteria, different processes for awarding, and in themselves are not adequate to cover the gap so developers go to the state and they go to the federal government. We've argued that we really need to coordinate all these investments so that they flow together, either through a single agency at the regional level, or at least in ways that align in terms of what they're looking to reward and incentivize, and the criteria for getting them.
Yeah, I think the focus of my question, I apologize if I wasn't clear, was that since California has abolished all redevelopment agencies and there no longer exists these redevelopment funds, that possibly there's a process by which we could look at something akin to this new California Housing Accelerator, where those funds could be generated from the state level on a more uniform basis. But it's just difficult to understand what the relative costs are for for each jurisdiction. Obviously, they're different based on some of the underlying costs, as you mentioned, with land costs and labor, but from a regulatory perspective and access to a source of funds that's specific for affordable housing.
Yeah, so maybe let me just put 2 more points on that then. Number one, we are billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars away from being able to fully fund the affordable housing needs that we have in this state, even with the resources that we currently have deployed. So looking at additional ways to bring that money forward from the local governments, whether through tax increment financing or otherwise, is all good. What redevelopment did do that our current investments from the state don't do very well is help finance the acquisition and development and preparation of sites that today don't work very well for affordable housing. They have environmental challenges, they have infrastructure needs. Our current funding sources don't do that very well. Redevelopment also historically put local governments very much in the driver's seat, gave them some sense of ownership over those affordable projects. And that's largely missing from a lot of our state funding sources that have filled that gap since then. So although we have a lot of money in affordable housing, number one, it's still not enough. And number two, I think we need to figure out how we can have more flexible funding flowing to help local governments do that infrastructure work and site acquisition and prep.
Those are great perspective on some of the realities of how redevelopment worked. Do we have any other questions from any of the commissioners? Commissioner Swanberger.
Thanks, Ben, for your work and for your testimony. I've read some of the reports that the Terner Center has put out, and it's been, very, very helpful and very informative. For my question, kind of back it out, not just affordable housing, but thinking about all housing, because I think California has an issue with providing housing at all levels, including market rate housing. So with that in mind, I'm going to give you 2 sentences to finish, as if you're, sitting in a coffee shop talking frankly to a good buddy. One is the first sentence: California is on a really good path to providing the housing that's needed because. And second sentence: boy, California's in trouble. I don't know if we're going to be able to provide the housing needed because.
I love it. Thank you for the prompts. So I'm really excited about where California is right now because there has been undeniably significant momentum and tangible progress in rolling back a lot of the policy and regulatory barriers, particularly in the zoning and oversight context. I think the SB 9 I think is very significant. I think our reforms to the housing element that I talked about in my remarks are extremely promising. None of that's the full solution. But it puts us on a path to, if you play that momentum forward, it takes us in a really exciting direction where we're making some major progress. I am very worried about California's housing crisis because one of the underlying challenges where we've made little to no progress is actually bending the curve on what it costs to construct housing today. And in a world in which the bottom quintile of Californians are not getting any richer, they're not getting any more income, they're not seeing their incomes going up, and housing cost to construct is just getting higher and higher. We have a sort of a fundamental perpetual disconnect, which means we can't rely on the marketplace to be building the homes that bottom tranche of Californians are going to need. That's a problem that's really challenging. Again, it reflects the cost of inputs like labor and materials, which have gone up well above the rates of inflation. But it also gets to things that we can wrestle with and need to wrestle with, but are politically very, very hard. Number one is the fact that a lot of cash-strapped municipalities rely over excessively on impact and permitting fees, which provide a brake on the construction of new housing. And second of all, for better and for worse, we have built in California an incredibly complicated residential building code with stipulations around seismic, fire, energy, all of which are well-intentioned, but have resulted in a regulatory building permit compliance that requires our housing to be vastly overbuilt relative to what we did historically and what we see in the rest of the country.
Thank you for that. That's very helpful, and I think gives us even more food for thought on ways to address these problems.
Great. Commissioner Byer, do you have a follow-up?
No, but I think what the witness just said is an excellent summary of the point that I was trying to make earlier about excessive regulation. And my conclusion is that people recognize that it exists, but no one is in charge of rooting out solutions to it. Everybody says, well, it's fine if we have this or this kind of regulation, but nobody's assessing the effect on the largest issue facing the state. We're not going to get to any kind of racial equity or income equity without addressing housing. We're not going to improve our healthcare outcomes unless we deal with the density problems and homelessness. So it is the most important issue, in my view, most important issue in the state in the short term. And we're nibbling around the edges because of the politics of it. And I'm not sure what a viable solution is other than the antiseptic of public scrutiny. And that goes to what this witness and the prior witness talked about, which is data and making clear that the cost of constructing housing is related to the cost of regulation. And it's something we can do something about.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Byer. Commissioner Erner, got your hand raised?
Yeah, so thank you, Ben, for your testimony. I want to get to this regulation issue because when we, as we watch, Ben, as you know, I live in Berkeley, and I presume that you must live close by if you're at the university. And the city of Berkeley just passed an ordinance, right, that any new construction can't cannot use gas appliances. They have to use electric appliances. My presumption, I'm not an environmental expert or anywhere near that, so I have to presume that that's probably a good idea. All right. But obviously that's going to be difficult for builders and all of that. And also, I guess, for those of us that might want to do something additional to our house, whether or not we're going to be required to then get rid of our, gas utilities and use electric. I don't even know if it goes that far. But what I've discovered over the years is that we add regulations, but we never get rid of regulations. And so it's kind of an ever-growing, book, right? No matter what department we're talking about. And so because the regulations that we're now talking about, we heard the secretary talk about the fact that we need to be conscious of climate change and how housing affects climate change. We need to be aware. You've mentioned the whole healthcare, the issue of health, right, and density that I think Commissioner Byer mentioned. There are so many new things, fires, right? I mean, and how that impacts our housing stock and whether or not those houses should be rebuilt in the same place where the next fire is going to come 5 years from now, and or the Russian River always is flooding every other year. The Russian River overflows, and maybe not during droughts, obviously, but in heavy rain seasons. And we still allow those people to rebuild, whether or not that's a good idea or not. And so I'm interested is the Terner Center looking at the whole regulatory package? Because it is hard to imagine that regulations that were developed, let's say, in the early 1900s, right? And I have no idea if the regulatory package goes back that far, but whether or not we look at the entire package, because maybe the new regulations are really good ideas, but maybe past regulations really don't matter any longer. Are we asking for things that really aren't important in order to develop housing stock? Has anybody done that kind of a review to get rid of the ones we don't need?
Oh no, yeah, oh no, not at all. I think that would be fantastic if we could find the time and capacity and bandwidth to do that. But I think the political temptation is perversely, if you will, to add to the regulatory, even in the context of new vehicles for doing streamlining or expediting. We simply add another section of code or statute that provides a new channel to do that streamlining. So we haven't, we don't sort of, there's nobody really tasked with doing that unwinding. I think, there are, if I could dream on, if you indulge me, I mean, I think, we do, in the context of new regulations and new statute, we actually do a decent job of trying to understand the financial impact of that to the state. So anytime a new bill is passed in California, we run it through the scrubber before it gets voted on to understand what the financial impact will be to the state and to local governments. Anytime a state agency adopts a new regulation, it goes to the Department of Finance, who require that financial estimate be calculated to understand its fiscal impact. Maybe we need to think about a housing calculator at the same time. Maybe there needs to be somebody in Sacramento whose job is to look at the full gamut of legislation and regulation that gets passed. Sometimes has nothing to do with housing on its surface, but in fact has ripple effects to our ability to deliver the supply we need. And if nothing else, needs to lift that up so it's not lost out of the conversation. So we can actually have an honest dialogue that says, we need to solve our climate change crisis. And that's why we need to go all in with conversions to electric from gas. But we've done an analysis and we know that will have this quantifiable impact reduction on how much housing will get built. Let's not say we don't do it, maybe we do it, but we need to have that
information
getting done.
Yeah. I think years ago, before Prop 140 was passed, that the Legislative Analyst's Office did that kind of work on legislation. They don't do that any longer. They only do it on the budget. And so there is no kind of third-party review, right? The Department of Finance does an evaluation. Some people would call that to be neutral. So others would not call that to be neutral at all. But the LAO used to do that. Whether or not they did it in the depth you're talking about, I don't know. But it's an interesting idea to have somebody do that. Thanks for that.
Okay, I'm not seeing any further questions for you, Mr. Metcalf. Thank you so much for your testimony. I think it's critical. I think we've looked at various aspects of data-driven strategies to make our government more efficient. I think your testimony on that is extremely valuable. So thank you so much for that.
My pleasure. I'm so happy to be here. So grateful that you all are taking the time on this important topic, and obviously happy to continue to be a resource individually and through the Turner Center as you continue to work in the space. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm sure if staff has follow-up questions, you'll hear from them.
Yes, please.
Okay. Ethan, are you going to take over at this point?
I am, I believe, Mr. Chairman. So we can now move into public comment after those three excellent witnesses. So the directions for public comment are on the screen now. So for members of the public, you may use the raised hand function in Zoom, or you may send an email, do so immediately, to Little Hoover, all one word, Little Hoover @lhc.ca.gov. Please indicate the phone number from which you are calling so that staff knows who to unmute when you are called on. As is the commission's normal practice, public comment is limited to 3 minutes per speaker, so please limit your comments to 3 minutes. So again, raise hand in Zoom or email right away, littlehoover@lhc.ca.gov. And with that, I will ask Ashley if we have any indications of people wishing to make public comment.
Yes, we do have a few raised hands, and I'm going to start with Paul. Paul, I'm turning on your ability to talk.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, thank you, Vice Chair. I'd like to share my experience as a citizen and first-generation immigrant here. I purchased a piece of land in the rural Santa Clara, like to build a house there. So the challenge which I see I like to see problem and like to share the solution. Challenge I see is that our county employees, city employees, they all want to help, but they need empowerment. Currently, they don't understand what the rules are. In my discussion with I think one of the firemen was on the call, he mentioned that, oh, we don't know what the rules are, please go to this hearing. I think that is a challenge. Nobody knows what the rules are and how we should empower the people, the citizens, to go fulfill their dream or live their American dream. So after looking into this problem, I thought about what we do in a lot of other industries. Being an engineer, we all buy the laptop, but every federal government does not go and test that laptop and certify it. So what there are independent labs who certify it, and we submit the data to the federal government or the respective agencies to get the approval. Why cannot we institute a program where we have registered architects, civil engineers, they look at it, prepare a plan, and they submit to the city, and we go with that. And right now we have so much complex process to go through, and there's no end to that cycle. And I think it's a lack of clear understanding and rules defined for the city and county employees to go. They can help. They are helpless. They want to help people, but they are helpless with the procedure and process, the lawsuits, CEQA, you name it, all of you know it. So that's the kind of my experiences, and like to share my thoughts here. And the second thing I see that fire is a big issue. In my discussion with that, say, oh, we need to look into the roads and everything. You know, a lot of these rural communities were built 50, 70, 80 years ago. Rules were different. Their roads are there. They need little upgrade. Okay, but I think if we sit together as a community, the statewide guidance to CAL FIRE or other agencies, go prepare an exit plan with every community. I have not seen anyone coming and discussing. A lot of these communities have HOAs. And if we can come together and say, okay, if something happens, because fires will occur, okay, there's a natural reasons for them until we clear our fires and other things. So we plan it. This is how citizens will go out. This is how the first responders will come in, and we solve the problem.
Your 3 minutes have expired, sir. If you can wrap up very quickly, please.
Yes, so I was just going to say that if we can get all together, define those rules, and then we don't have to go through this cycle. We have a mitigation planning process, approve the people can build their houses and live their life. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much. And I believe actually that Ashley, are you still in the meeting? I believe I just saw that.
Yes.
Oh, you are. Okay.
Yes.
Ashley, can we go on to the next speaker, please?
Yes. Next we have Susan Kirsch. Susan, I'm turning on your ability to talk.
Okay, thank you. This is the second of the Little Hoover Institute Commission meetings I've listened to. They've been fabulous, so thank you for organizing these. I'm the founder of a statewide agency organization called Catalyst for Local Control. And we've been watching these issues of housing pretty closely. And I was struck today by Secretary Ramírez's statement early on about saying solving a problem is often contingent on properly understanding what the problem is. And so I've got a couple of questions here that are kind of related to that idea of, are we properly understanding the problem? So you've been talking for almost 2 hours about the issue primarily of affordability and what a challenge that is for everybody. And if we look at affordability, it is primarily an issue of a matter of means, of how much discretionary income we have to be able to do anything, to go out to dinner or buy a house or take a vacation. So what we seem to be ignoring is the magnitude of the problem of income inequity, which has a bit to do with how people accumulate asset value if they have a house. But we seem to be paying far too little attention to those bigger problems of wages and income and tax regulations and tax structures. So I'd be curious of any of you commenting on that as part one of my question and comment. The second thing has to do with, there's been a lot of conversation about regulations, and often in regulations that's referring to streamlining in order to reduce the cost for builders, and often streamlining that is especially applied to CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. Many of us look at 40 or 50 years of CEQA protections being more important than ever as the climate crisis continues to get worse and worse. So it seems to be something very unsettling about the idea that we would be streamlining for the benefit of developers. And a part of the streamlining, if the opposite of streamlining is adding complexity, then what we're doing is adding greater and greater complexity to what cities have to deal with complicated laws, like more than 30 housing laws, I think, that have been passed in the past few years. So some way of looking at, are we really understanding the problem that's been talked about here? And maybe a final part of that is to say, in the cities where people live, what we're finding, in addition to homelessness, which is a terrible aspect of the fact that we've got income inequity, is also the fact that people are idling in their cars as they wait to get out of town, even if there's not a fire, there's that.
Ms. Kirsch, your 3 minutes has expired. If you can wrap up very quickly, please.
I am happy just to get those issues on the table and would welcome any comments to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Ashley, if we can go on to the next speaker, please.
It looks like we do not have any additional requests for public comment, either via email or Zoom.
All right, then. Mr. Chairman, I think we have then completed the agenda for today's meeting. So unless you have additional comments, I would just, I can remind the commission of the next meeting.
I don't have any additional comments. Commissioner Byer, I know you're unmuted. Did you have any further comments?
No.
Okay. Okay.
Very good then. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I believe we've completed the agenda for today's meeting. The Housing Subcommittee will be meeting very shortly to consider this and move forward on this study. I would just briefly mention, remind the commission that our next meeting is a business meeting this Monday, the 27th at 1 p.m., a very unusual day and time for us. This was the time that worked for most of you. This Monday, the 27th at 1 p.m., we have only one agenda item, as the commission is aware, which is to discuss whether or not the commission wishes us to pursue hearings on potential reform of the recall system. So if the commissioners can mark their calendars this Monday, the 27th at 1 p.m. for that one agenda item, that will be, I think, a fairly brief meeting. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I have nothing else. If you do not, I think we can adjourn.
Okay, I would like to just again thank our speakers today for taking their valuable time. I thought it was really good testimony today, and hopefully that's really helpful to staff and the subcommittee to start developing the report. So with that, I think we can be adjourned.
Thank you.